Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. Today's episode needs little in the way of introduction. The great Glenn Fleishman returns, and we talk some more about Amazon's founding mythologies, as well as that recent New York Times article about the Amazon work culture that got so much attention. And towards the end, we talk at length about what the web revolution has meant for writers, as opposed to the companies and publishers, which we have already covered at great length. So please enjoy Glenn Fleishman. Glenn Fleishman, thanks for coming back on the Internet History Podcast.
It is a pleasure to be here, Brian.
Well, Glenn, we have a whole grab bag of things that have been piling up over the months to bring you on and talk about again. What I wanted to start with were several times over the last several months, Amazon has been coming up, and you've been commenting on Twitter. And back in May, you got in a couple conversations about the hagiography of the legend of Amazon and its foundings and things like that. And I think I said to you in our first time we talked that Amazon's been the hardest company for me to kind of get the history right, because it does seem to be all legend. And even a place like eBay, where they gave up the ghost on the legend of the Pez dispenser at eBay and stuff, and so you can get the real story. But Amazon, it's hard to poke through. So let's, and with the caveat that this is all from your perspective.
Correct.
What are some of the issues or some of the items or some of the things about the legend of Amazon's founding and early days that you feel like are just legend, that have been burnished to make history look good?
Oh, sure. And I'll point out, I don't know if I mentioned this in the previous podcast. I may have, but I met Jeff Bezos in, I want to say, summer of, was it 94? Now I'm blanking out which year it was. When did they launched? It must have been summer of 95. And I think they started shipping books that summer. Mm-hmm. And I had a receipt somewhere. I ordered some of the first books Amazon ever shipped in their private beta. And at some point I was doing something years later, and a customer service person wrote to me and said, "Oh, I see some of your first books ordered from us were actually packed by Jeff Bezos." I'm like, "Yes, they were." I've got a few, so I ordered a Douglas Hofstadter book, of course, because that's what you order in those days. But I met Jeff very early on. I knew one of the first employees, I did mention last podcast, he was a friend of my housemate at the time, as a computer science grad student. And I would have lunch with Jeff, and I had a successful internet company, and he was the startup with nothing. And I don't mean that in he was an idiot, whatever. I wasn't raising money. I had a little boutique business, and he was raising money and building the thing up, and it was growing, and it was exciting. But I'd have lunch with him regularly, and I'd interview him for some tech articles, and I wasn't like an Amazon promoter, but it was his offices were only a few blocks away. Ultimately, when they moved downtown, I had an office in a fancy Class A building. They were in the heroin district of Seattle. And then the tide shifted, because I never wanted to get big. I didn't raise money. I didn't do anything like that. Mm-hmm. But I was talking to Jeff, and then in the company in the very early days. So I saw stuff happening, and it is hilarious to me later when I read what people say happened, because A, they weren't there, or B, they were there and they seem to have forgotten. I don't think it's intentional, because none of the people talking about it later have a stake in it. It's not like they're like, "Oh, this story, I have to tell it because it reaffirms my time there," or whatever as I was doing it. I think either legitimately they forgot, or they weren't involved and they think they were because they were one person away. And I'm like, no, I saw this, what was going on.
Well, and you had a unique perspective, because you started out, you were almost like mentor kind of, because you had already had a company up and running, and so early on Jeff would come to you sometimes for advice, and then later on you do join the company, and you're one of the executives at early on with the company. So I was a manager. I didn't reach the executive level. I reported to executives, and I had a little bit of, I would say, power beyond my scope early on, which faded as they got a top-heavy executive staff. So I don't want to oversell what I did. Right. It was things like, they were trying to find a good internet service provider of all things. I'm like, oh, I have this company I work with. I introduced them. I gave them, it wasn't, no business advice at all. It was mostly technical
stuff, and that's part of what led Jeff to offer me to, said, why don't you come and join us when I was really bored with my business. It wasn't going anywhere, wasn't getting any bigger, and it was a lot of work. And he's like, hey, come over here and join what I'm doing. Said,
right. So if you haven't listened to Glenn's first time on, I believe it's episode 48. Actually, don't quote me on that, but somewhere around episode 48 from February 9th of earlier this year. But so specifically, what are some of the things that now when you hear you read about or you hear people say about the early days that you're like, that's just not how I remember it happening?
Well, here's one that, and I wasn't there for this, but this is one of the ones that gets me, it's the epic journey driving across country, Jeff writing a business plan while Mackenzie, his wife, is driving, which didn't happen. And I don't know that he ever told the story. I think I mentioned this in the previous podcast. Jeff openly admits he has a terrible memory, a surprisingly bad, experiential memory for somebody who is so brilliant. I don't know if the two go together. There's absent-mindedness and so forth, but he really doesn't remember the past very well. And I think that plays into some of the stories that get told because he doesn't contradict them because he's like, I don't know, maybe that's how it happened. And they did drive across country, but they drove to Texas. He'd already written the business plan while he was at D.E. Shaw because he was examining new fields. He went to Texas where his grandparents and parents were, and then they drove to Seattle after that, and they hooked up with some people they knew, and they started, rolling into raising some money, starting with Nick Hanauer, was the head of Pacific Coast Feathers. His family owned that company, and then Nick went on to found Avenue A with including one of my former bosses at Amazon. So that epic writing the business plan in the passenger seat while your wife is driving thing is like, well, that's not really what happened, but it's sort of a founding myth, and you hear it repeated a lot. Because it's romantic. It's like, no, that's not really what
right. And he had already attempted to hire Shel Caffin. I don't know if I had spoken to Shel.
I don't know. Didn't know that. That's
I did. Yeah. There's the episode right around yours. I did an interview with Shel.
I haven't listened to the whole one. Okay, yeah, I've listened to part of that. Ah.
So yeah, as I understand it, so that legend is it kind of is designed to be like, I'm just figuring things out as I go along, but based on what you're saying, and also Shel's timeline, he's already plotting it out. He's already determined that Seattle is probably where he wants to be for all the reasons that, the sales tax issue versus California, also the proximity to the book distributors and things like that. So,
yeah, I forgot if we talked about this, but there was a specific, was it called Northwest Pipeline or something like that? It was a book distributor in Seattle that was really quite large. It was a regional one, but it was large. Then you had the computer science department here. You had unemployment, we had a higher unemployment rate, I think, when he came out here than the rest of the country. You had Boeing engineers looking for new things to do. You had the Roseburg, Oregon super warehouse of Ingram that was, I forget what the drive is, 4-hour drive away. So all the Northwest book distributor went out of business due to technical mismanagement a few years. It was while I was there. They became incapable of actually doing anything because of failed software migration and went out of business. But that was so some books could be obtained within an hour or a day from just either from a warehouse down the street or from a warehouse 4 hours drive away.
Well, and another one that I think you even wrote a blog post about this is the famous door desk story, which still gets repeated constantly today. But so what's from your point of view and your memory, what's the real story on that?
Well, I saw receipts. This is why my story is valid. As a journalist, I want to know, how does this person know this? And I didn't keep receipts because I was working at a company. I probably would have violated the law if I'd photocopied them and taken them out. But so, yeah, the creation myth is, they're so frugal. Instead of buying desks, they turned doors into desks. And you'd walk into Amazon in the early days, and I don't know when this changed because they moved into real office space at some point, and everybody had a door as a desk. And there are some advantages to a door desk because doors are big, and desks that you buy, from in those days there was a local place called Ducky's that's still around that sold used office supplies pretty cheaply, or you go to IKEA or any of the other stores that sell, cheap office supplies. And a desk was small, might have been flimsy, wasn't whatever, and a desk door had big square bracketed legs on each corner. These 2x2s or 4x4s, or I think 4x4s, or 2x2s, and but that was sort of part of the myth. It was like, they are so frugal. I remember, I think I wrote this story in my post about it. First time I met Jeff at his office in. I went to see the office in the heroin district, and I'm not really kidding. It was the district in which people sold heroin on that couple block range. It shifted around, and there was a methadone clinic across the street. And he's like, oh, yeah, meet me in the office. And we'll go have lunch. And I meet him, and I walk into the office, and I burst out laughing. He's like, what? I'm like, this is brilliant. And, like threadbare carpet, desk door. I think he had a rack, a clothing rack that was all blue shirts, because that's what he wore. And I was like, investors must love this. He's like, yep. And he didn't say like, it's all fraud and it's a fake. It's nothing like, he didn't say anything like that, but it was clear there was a cultivated impression. You brought investors into that office and you said, these people are not spending extra money. And I don't know, the desk door said we're cheap, but it said we're clever. We're not doing the thing that everyone else is doing and whatever. But here's the secret that we were talking about. I did write this post about it years ago, and it occasionally gets bursts of activity, is it costs more to make a door into a desk by far than it did to buy a reasonable desk that had good ergonomic properties and that was more appropriately sized for an office and for someone's use.
Yeah, doors aren't exactly cheap. I don't know if anyone's been in the market for a decent door recently, but...
No, they're heavy. They were solid core, because if they weren't solid core, you'd puncture through it. They're not, the veneer ones are not meant to be weight bearing. And maybe some of them were veneer, but even those are not. Those are, I don't know, those were so flimsy, they bend in the middle. So my recollection is these were solid core. There was once, I don't know, we're setting up a new part of this office space we had at Second and Columbia. And a guy comes out, he's a contractor they hired. They're paying somebody an hourly wage during a business boom in Seattle. And he's there cutting wood inside the office to fit and making this desk. And he's there for hours, and there's all this mess, and he cleans it up, and he's got, he's had to bring in 2x4s or 2x2s. Oh, no, I'm sorry, 4x4s. I keep saying 2x2s. 4x4, posts, which are really solid. And I forget if you had to cut the door down. You can't use a hollow core if you have to cut it down. And the things weighed a ton, and you couldn't get them through the doorway typically because they're a door with legs on it. So, and the ergonomics were horrible. The people, especially customer service, spent a lot of time, kind of in one fixed position for hours, working really intensely. And some of the programmers constantly complaining about, wrists and back, and people were, trying to get sick leave for problems like that. So it's just not that other desks are wonderful, but you could just go on out. I mean, Ducky's, like I say, is this local office supply store that delivered. We could have been buying desks there for a fraction of them, had them delivered, set up, and been an appropriate size, and could have been moved around if necessary too.
Are there any other legends that stick in your craw when you hear them, just off the top of your head?
Well, I think there's this persistent myth, which I think we talked about last time a little bit, that Jeff had this full-blown vision for what Amazon has become.
That's exactly... if you hadn't brought that up, that was going to be my next question.
Well, and it's just totally false. And I'm not saying that Jeff told, certainly not me, everything, or other people or anything, but if you look at, the best guide is go to Robert Spector's Get Big Fast, which came out in the early 2000s, and he talked to everybody who would talk about Amazon, which was some ex-employees and nobody there because everyone was too chary to talk because there was a lot of money at stake at that point. And you can see that there was really very little discussion by anybody in any stretch of the imagination about much of what Amazon has become outside of media now. And back then, I mean, I'm not trying to say I wasn't Jeff Bezos' confidant. There were other people who were his confidant. There were his business advisors like Nick Hanauer and other folks, and he kept his own counsel. And his wife is also brilliant. She was involved in the company in the early days, and then became a novelist, published novelist, and so she was involved in the early stages of setting up the company for at least a year and a half, and so again, I'm not trying to pretend that I have special knowledge. If I don't know something, that it means it didn't happen. But we talked, and Jeff with me and with lots of other people at the company, we talked about what the future would bring and what it was about. And the only real clear direction was, it wasn't going to be an everything store. It was going to be a store that sold a lot of stuff, and media seemed to be the lowest hanging fruit with the highest profit. And it was clear there'd be other stuff that would get encompassed in there. But there was barely, we hadn't even started, there was a program to allow publishers, smaller publishers, to stock books with us and then sell them on their behalf. And that didn't start while I was there, but it was in the works. And that became, that's essentially become a fulfillment program that parallels stuff that UPS and other companies offer. I used that for my the magazine book, as I used fulfillment by Amazon. And Amazon, what they call it, multi-channel sales, so these two divisions. And I shipped my books to an Amazon warehouse, and then you can buy it from Amazon. And I could also upload addresses of people who had backed the book in the Kickstarter, and they just shipped them out on my behalf. So there were elements of that. But this thing of, selling clothing, for instance, or selling every kind of retail thing. I mean, there was an idea they'd sell more, and they got into tools, which was terrible because of the shipping costs, and pet stuff, which was terrible because of the shipping costs and complexity. And, they were clearly moving towards more retail categories. But all the different things they're doing today, there was no idea at the time that those would happen unless they were like a secret back of the mind, back of an envelope thing that Jeff kept to himself. Even things like Amazon Web Services, which is now apparently a huge driver of, it's a very fast-growing revenue category, and it's apparently profitable. They've been breaking out, more information, and people are looking to AWS, where Amazon is renting computer capacity and storage capacity to other companies as potentially maybe it'll become a subsidiary, another division, or maybe it'll be a real revenue or a real driver of profit margin in the future, even with a huge competitive war going on. That was in nobody's mind at the time. They had hired a guy just before I left who had extensive conversations with about storage because we were storing book covers and my group was scanning book covers and we're getting scans from Ingram and other companies. And I met with him because he was being hired to deal with kind of the infrastructure, because our infrastructure was very small and thin, and good people, but it needed to grow massively. And we had conversations about this, and I will tell you, this was the guy who was implementing it. I talked to Jeff about this as well at the time. There was no idea this would turn into a business it was a great development of a business. I'd say AWS is a brilliant idea, and a lot of companies are in that space now, before and after Amazon. But that was certainly not part of what was thought about as well.
I mean, we can only speculate on this, and I'm not asking you to validate my own theories. But, I mean, it just feels to me, especially after I did the research on eBay as well, that, I read all these books of Sam Walton and stuff, and I was looking for parallels between Amazon and Walmart, and it felt to me like at some point, like you said, they wanted to be a big e-tailer, mostly for media. But then he sort of gets to the idea that, well, but we can be a Walmart for the 21st century. And then the reason I bring up eBay is because from all of the competition that people told me about when Amazon, I know you were gone by this point, but when Amazon tried to go head-to-head with eBay in auctions, I think my theory would be that that was sort of his everything store perfect model because eBay didn't have any warehouses. eBay, so
exactly.
And so maybe it legitimately just is along the way he has been throwing stuff against the wall, and some of the bigger stuff just always kept sticking and sticking, so he's throwing bigger and bigger things, you know what I mean? And so maybe it is just the evolution of learning and learning what works.
Right. I totally appreciate that. It's the mythos. This comes up in another place too, is people, not only does Amazon spread the myth, but other people spread it who do not have any connection to Amazon, which I find is fascinating. So I never read the New Yorker article. It's from George Packer wrote this in February 2014. I'm pulling up while we're talking about Amazon, which got a lot of attention at the time because I started reading it, and it has something that I know is false at the very beginning. And Amazon, responding to the article, said it was false. And I don't know how the New Yorker published this because it's an anecdote from someone remembering something that happened 19 years before that. Mm-hmm. But it ties into this. It says, I won't read this in full, but it says, 1995, Bezos was, Bezos was manning an Amazon booth at Book Expo America in Chicago. And I joined the company the next year after a book expo that year, and people had come back. And it says there's a fellow, and I won't say the guy's name, but he's in the article. He saw a sign that said Earth's biggest bookstore. He quizzes Bezos. Why? Where is it? Cyberspace. We started a website. Who are your suppliers? Ingram and Baker and Taylor, which was true. Ours too. What's your database? Books and print. Ours, which is not accurate. Ours too. So what makes you Earth's biggest? We have the most affiliate links, a form of online advertising. What's your business model? Blah, blah, blah. And he said, so here's the thing. Bezos said that Amazon intended to sell books as a way of gathering data on affluent, educated shoppers. The books would be priced close to cost in order to increase sales volume. After collecting data on millions of customers, Amazon could figure out how to sell everything else dirt cheap on the internet. And then in parens, Amazon says that its original business plan, quote, contemplated only books, unquote. And afterwards, this guy told his partner at the bookstore, I just met the world's biggest snake oil salesman. It's going to be really bad for books. I didn't read the rest of the article because that is incorrect. Almost everything about this is incorrect. Amazon was purchasing from Ingram, Baker, Taylor, as well as this local bookstore. The database was not books in print. Jeff never talked about the most affiliate links. He never mentioned that at all. The program, I can't remember how old it was in '95, but it wasn't. I don't remember if the associates program had started.
I don't think so. Actually, don't quote me on that, but I don't think it had started yet.
It was a big innovation, but I think it was I want to say it was the next year. The guy who started was a super nice guy, one of the nicest people at Amazon. I'm blanking on his name. He had come, I think, from Microsoft, and it was his idea, and it, of course, turned into a massive thing from Amazon. But Jeff would never, ever have said, we were looking for margin, that we weren't trying to price close to cost. All of our books were, I think when I got there, this is 95, right? And I think they were pricing, I don't remember what the discounts were. They weren't crazily huge originally. It wasn't until Barnes & Noble got online and some other things happened that they started to do the really serious discounting in maybe in 97. So, and we never talked about collecting data on customers. There were privacy issues. We didn't have the amount of data to store. Our Oracle database was getting over. This is articles quoting 95. In 96, in 97, one of the reasons I left is because our systems were unable to handle the amount of data coming in. And that got fixed after I left, and things, went from there. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar company. But pretty much the New Yorker ran a story in which one person recounted an anecdote from 19 years before, and I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Its original business plan was books. By the time I joined there, they were thinking about other media and hired somebody before I left to focus on DVDs and other categories of goods, and it was clear it was going to, go from there. But it's just, I feel like this is a retconned story, and the fact that New Yorker included it meant I didn't want to vet the rest of the article for accuracy, because I thought, I don't know. And there's other people quoted it. I know I have issues with some other people quoted in it and their accuracy. And anyway, so I walked away from it. And the same thing, the Everything Store book, the excerpts I read from it, I palpably know the stuff that occurred during my time and within a few years after, when I knew tons of people there. A lot of them did not accord with what I know to be the truth. It's not like a speculation or secondhand. It's like I know, well, I should say either firsthand or secondhand, I know not. So these stories have been told now by reporters and publications, which is why they're so pervasive as well.
And I don't believe that Bezos himself has ever participated in any of these books. Actually, as an aside, when the 20th anniversary was coming around, I was working with Amazon PR. And for about a week, I think they might have been considering letting me do just the idea was just to keep it on the founding, keep it on the 20 years. And they ultimately declined. But if you guys are still listening, there's always the door is always open if Jeff ever wants to do a oral history.
Well, the pisser is that it really is a great founding. Like, he really came up with an idea at a time people weren't thinking about it. He challenged the fact that Barnes & Noble, which had, was this giant destroyer, and then you had Borders, you had all these chains, you had multiple chains, and Barnes & Noble was the biggest, I believe, that had revolutionized accessibility to books. Like Barnes & Noble and these superstores, the thing they did so well is they made it possible to buy tens of thousands, sometimes even, I think it was the biggest store had 75,000 unique titles in the store. That was fantastic. Now, the Riggio brothers are pieces of work, and Barnes & Noble has fallen mightily from where it is, and they missed all the opportunities by not understanding what the internet was about. We laughed when their site came online because of what they'd chosen to do, but that was an incredible idea, and you could say that Bezos's brilliance wasn't saying, look, we can have everything online. We are going to fake it. And part of my job there was to fake it, is that we had an inventory of, I think it was like 1.2 million books that we knew we could get from distributors within, we could have them shipped to us within like 1 to 3 days, I think, something like that. I forget the full time frame, but we listed 1.2 million in print. I did this program that I'm sure I told you about the last podcast, the out of print book program, which got us all these hard to find books that were used, that we knew had been printed at some point, maybe we could source. And that took us to like 2.5 million. And that was a bragging point, right? But the idea that everything that had ever been printed was in some degree of being available at a click, I think that's an incredibly powerful idea. And even the fact that because it was doing something so new, he didn't go out and just raise piles of venture capital. And Nick Hanauer went out and got 30 people to pony up $30,000 towards the first million Amazon raise. Also, an amazing, interesting story. I think it's much better than writing a business plan while you're driving cross country. Like, that's romantic. But I think the fact that you had to cobble together money for probably the most disruptive and revolutionary idea that had occurred in book selling since Barnes & Noble, to me, that's much more interesting than the other stories.
Well, and this came up a lot with the recent New York Times article from a week or two ago. the fact that Amazon is almost alone among the first generation web companies that is still absolutely relevant and dominant. I mean, Netscape is gone, Yahoo got eclipsed. The fact that 20 years on, Amazon is not only still around, but still dominant in what it does and still absolutely relevant. One of the four horsemen or whatever they call it.
But look at Yahoo is still there, but a shell of itself.
Yeah, so I mean, it's an amazing entrepreneurial story because it absolutely still has moved with the times and still been dominant, and so that that does lead us into the other thing I wanted to talk about, which was the recent New York Times piece that got a lot of play all over the blogosphere and Twitter and whatnot. I'll include a link in the show notes, of course, but if you want to Google it right now while we're talking. It's called Inside Amazon, Wrestling Big Ideas in a Bruising Workplace by Jody Cantor and David Streitfeld.
Well, Jody and I went to college together. I didn't know her very well, but I'm pretty sure she worked on the daily paper when I worked on the weekly paper.
So I want to kind of approach this in a way that I don't really have a strong feeling about this one way or another. I think you might possibly do, but I want to approach it from the angle of, well, if you haven't read the article, it was controversial because it basically paints a picture of the white collar sort of mid-level management and, above and below work at Amazon. The workplace is sort of hellish, is the way some people would describe it. At the very least, very challenging and very hard hitting and so first of all, let's do this. I know for a fact that from the recent Amazon interview people that I've gotten recently, that former Amazon people are still they're a tight-knit group, especially on Facebook and other places. So yes. I was curious, were you privy to the reaction of former Amazonians to this article?
I'm pretty much too far away from that now. So I saw for years after I worked there, I stayed in touch with people, and then people moved, we lost touch, and they were working. I often had this joke that they were working at a time speed faster than mine. So we got further and further away in time because they were working so much more intensely, and I was kind of like do in my my busy but little life, doing my own thing, and it was like they were in hyperspace, and I can't hear you, you're too far away. So I know people who work for Amazon now, but I don't know them I don't have close friends who work for them. So I hear stories from, sort of through people I know. I saw a little bit on Facebook from, somebody I know who works there now not in the Seattle office, was really angry about the article because she thought it was a huge misrepresentation because it does not conform to her work experience at all.
Right. You might not be able to judge this, but my first curiosity is, if you are an Amazon worker now, are you quietly being like, yeah, boy, that's kind of how tough it is? Or would most people working at Amazon be like, yeah, that was kind of a little of an exaggeration?
Well, so here's how I can break it down. It's like, we know, warehouse work, this is all about white collar work, really. And from hourly, or let's say office and business work. So it was people it mostly talked about people who have the power to do something within the company. So it's not even like administrative assistants. It's people who had jobs where they're given authority to go do something and they need to go do it. And there's a little bit of holacracy in there. That's that management theory that Zappos, which is a division of Amazon now, and some other companies have been experimenting with. Medium does it also, in which authority is distributed. So it's not like an anarchy. There's a company as a Valve is run as an anarchy of sorts, which is very interesting. I still want to learn more about that. How you hire and fire in an anarchy.
Valve, the video game company?
Yeah. They're an anarchy. They have this. No one is assigned work there, and per se. It's very interesting. I heard they have an economist, a consulting economist, and I heard him on a podcast a few years ago talk about how it runs, and I had my mind blown because they produce stuff, but it takes a very certain kind of person. The same thing, holacracy requires certain kinds of people, and Zappos, and I'm not saying Amazon is, but this is getting to there, is Zappos, there's just a big article about them because Zappos said, we're shifting everything to holacracy, and if you don't like it, you can leave, and we'll pay you a month's or whatever, and a lot of people left. And it's a question whether you can have these very complicated management theory style businesses in which ostensibly people who used to be very disempowered and at the bottom of a hierarchy in a traditional company, they get as much power to challenge and be involved and take charge of stuff. So people get put in charge of things, but there's just not that classic top-down approach. And Amazon is very top-down. It always was, still is. They just give people, I think one could argue the best case is they give people an enormous amount of rope with which to hang themselves, and then they will hang those people. So it's
right.
Some companies will give you a lot of room and they support and buffet you and they hope that you'll be able to take off and fly. Others are like, the plane crashed and let's move on, because that's gone. That plane's gone and we need another plane. Like, well, that was a person. It's like, nope, that was a bad idea and they're fired or they're never going to get a promotion here again.
Well, so we should say that it was the personal stories like that got a lot of the attention, where people would have had cancer, and then, the feeling was that
stillborn child.
Management didn't care. You better hit your marks, you better hit your numbers, and we have zero willingness to, like you said, cut anybody any slack. So let's just personally, what was your reaction to reading stories like that?
Well, it rang true to me, even though I hadn't heard stories that extreme. I knew that from people I know who left the company over the last decade. So Amazon, I think, has gone through several phases, and without going into too much depth, there's sort of the early startup phase in which it was, balancing on the point of a pin, and I thought was going to go actually out of business after I left in May '97. I thought it would be out of business within a few months because of technological problems that were not overcomable and weren't all their fault. And I also thought the management was not in good shape. Jeff was great. A lot of people below him were not. And a lot of those people left. And a lot of the technology problems were solved by hiring a lot of people and doing what seemed to be impossible and fixing things that were not within their control. So they were sort of at that phase, and they went public, and they were a stock market darling, and the stock goes up and up and up. Then the dot-com crash comes. They still, because they'd raised so much money and they'd actually sold junk bonds, senior discounted notes, they had piles of money to ride through a time that was really difficult. And then they've sort of had this period in which they're still seen as a startup. They've been growing in revenue constantly. They had inconsistent profit and not a lot of profit for most of that time. And that's like the last 10 years. So people left in that first, from 95 to say 2002, 2003, people came and went, and some of it was them laying people off, some of it was them outsourcing customer service or restructuring things. But let's say since about 2002, 2003, it's been sort of a different business. Like, not that it's super stable, but it's a much more conventional, growing, stable business that is burning cash for growth, as opposed to a startup that has no idea how it's going to get anywhere. And so I do know people who've left probably, I think in the last few years, everybody I knew who was there for a long time or been in and out of it is gone. But I'd heard stories, and none of them were as horrible as this. They were all stories like, I just simply can't work less. If I don't work these, crazy hours, like if I'm not working essentially all my waking time except a few hours spent on weekdays with the family and a little bit of time on the weekend and the occasional vacation, there's just no place for me there. There's that sort of story, which is a startup story, and they're not a startup. And Microsoft went through the phase where its stock became moribund, and they got a lot of people got poached, and it had to become. Microsoft is not a hard driving company in the way it was, and that's okay, because a lot of what they do is maintenance, and it is keeping stuff working. So you can have a 40-hour week, plus a bit, because it is tech. That Microsoft, and I would argue a lot of people work a fairly normal work week there, and the overlap into work-life balance is email outside of boundaries, but not like going in the office every Sunday for a year, right?
Okay, let me interrupt you, though, because I want to touch on that point exactly. Because there was a real backlash to this article from Silicon Valley people, from venture capitalists and whatnot, saying that, well, but this is why Amazon is successful. You just used Microsoft as an example, a counterexample, and so the backlash people would say, well, exactly. At some point, Microsoft stopped being a startup company, and so it fell behind the game. And one of the reasons they would say that Amazon still 20 years on is dominant is because it has never stopped being a startup. What would you say to that?
Well, I think I think there's multiple issues you have to untangle, because I think like Mark Andreessen and a bunch of other key investors and other people in Silicon Valley did that. They're like, hey, you can just leave and work for a company. It's not as hard driven. What's the big deal? It's like, well, So let me unpack that. So part of it, like, and they denied that. A lot of people denied that stuff this bad really happened that often. So, and that's fair. It's hard to know anecdotally how much horrible stuff is happening. You can get a sense from talking to a lot of people. And the New York Times reporters talked to 100 past and present Amazon employees. I know hundreds of people over 20 years, and I know my own experience. I know why I left, and why I left was I realized one day I would never be working less than I was working now. And I was already working at the limits of my physical abilities, and then I discovered a few months later I had cancer. So, hey, it probably was right for me to leave from a bunch of reasons. I may have had cancer even as I was working there and not realized it. And they didn't fire me because I was sick or I wasn't keeping up. I was keeping up. I just woke up one day and said, every day my work is going to get more denser, and I'm already working at much more than I want to. This is a silly thing to be doing. I think the company's going to fail. Which it seemed very likely, and several people left right around I did because they're like, we're not going to be here when this collapses around us and they can't pay their payroll. But it was also, I think I may have mentioned this, I was in charge of this out-of-print book program, and I got it launched, but I couldn't get it all the way through because of both, some of my, I think, personal and management problems about trying to get people to do stuff they didn't want to do. I wasn't that aggressive and angry maybe about it. And so it got handed off to someone else who did a great job finishing it up. And he was actually a pretty kind guy who had better political abilities than I did. And I realized I'm never going to go anywhere in the company. I've reached the highest point I can get. From now on, I'll have less responsibility and more to do. So I left. So I understand that sort of sense. That's what a startup is, right? You're like, you have to work really hard. If you screw up, you could get thrown out and whatever. Okay. So if I unpack the response to the article, one part is, this is just what life is like in the .com world. And I have to, and I'll take issue with that specifically to start with, is Amazon is not a startup. They're hard driving. They burn a lot of money, but there's a growing body of research that's very good that shows the more you work, you don't get more stuff done. And there's a lot of people say there's somewhere in the 40 to 50 hour a week range for most people. And it's not like I don't think it's accidental that we've centered on a 40-hour week in America and a few hours less in some other countries as a sensible week. And, in China, a 60-hour week, I think, is the legal limit now. It's something like that. And there's a lot of violations of it. But that's at the extreme, that's sort of at the extreme edge, because for sanity and rest and brain and everything else, it's very likely for manual labor and brain-related labor, our bodies and brains simply can't do it. And so if you have people working 80 hours a week, it is probably a lot of wasted time. That is probably being counted wrong. So there's an issue to me in general that, do we need to be working these hours? Yes, in crunch projects when you actually are super productive over sprints. Can you do this indefinitely? No, it breaks people. It is a way to burn people up. And if you don't want to accept that, then what you're doing is morally wrong. Because there is no way to work people on the schedules that are being demanded at startups all the time forever. And that seems to be in some divisions of Amazon, certainly not uniformly, absolutely not uniformly, but in some parts that aren't startup parts with new business lines, this is how things are all the time. People work really long hours all the time. They're expected to be available 24 hours a day. And I have heard these stories where people get called at all different times. The conference calls on Easter and Christmas or whatever that were in the article, or Thanksgiving, I think, were hilarious and inappropriate. It might have involved international calling, but that doesn't affect Easter. Anyway, so that's one part. So sprints are okay. And I've done that myself, where I've had months of intense work where I'm working every waking hour except for time spent with my family. I have to take time out to spend with my family and eat and sleep. But otherwise, I am working solidly for my own gains. And if I'm working in a startup, I get that. But it is not a sustainable practice. Second thing is, in America, we're in a unique position that you can work people that way. It would be illegal in most other places. Most developed nations would not allow you to work people under the conditions that Amazon works people in America, whether in warehouses or in white-collar jobs. You could argue Amazon is incredibly inefficient, is that it's burning through people. So and that's that retention rate thing that's come up, that it's been hard to pin down a number. Are they growing so fast still that people have a short tenure there, or are people leaving in droves? And that's why a lot of people there haven't worked more than a year at the job. That's something that's still, Amazon doesn't want to release the numbers. Some internal people are leaking information that makes it suggest that that people have a very short time there and they fry and they're gone. So if you were in, let's say, France or or the UK, which has, I think, a little bit looser labor related to closer to America, or even Canada, for Christ's sakes, that's north of us, right? You would not be in a job where you were working 80 hours a week, possibly at all. It might not even be considered feasible. If you were, you'd be compensated in some fashion. You would get the time off or money for that, those extra hours. It would be financially infeasible for most companies to do that. So they would simply hire, 50% or 100% more people, or they would become more efficient with what they're doing with labor. Amazon is absolutely, by any measure by which you look at how people are working there, they are on a track to destroy people, their bodies and lives, if they're asking them to work that many hours and all the time and be constantly alert. And they are incredibly inefficient because they're using those people's time badly. So that's like a big unpacking part of it, right? And that doesn't even address, so I think the hours are legitimate. I talk to people, I run into people, you overhear people in coffee shops. Amazon and newer startups here, there are cloud startups all over the place in Seattle and other tech starters. People are working crazy hours, but I think, and there are people at Amazon who clock in and out, or do 8:30 to 4:30 or 9 to 5 or whatever. There are people who do that, and I know people who do that, but I don't think that's the dominant mode there.
What is your response to the devil's advocate argument that, because Amazon still maintains that culture, that's why they're still on top?
Oh, I don't think that's that at all. I think, excuse me, I think Amazon is on top because they are so hungry and aggressive, and sometimes in very bad ways and sometimes in good ways. Like, the good ways are how they built AWS. Like, Amazon Web Services, I don't know anything negative to say about them, in the sense that, I'm sure that is like a startup division. One could argue people working at AWS are probably working crazy hours. There are probably a lot of people, especially at higher levels, but even like in the middle tier, who are like, we're building something incredible. No one has ever done this before. And I think it launched formally in 2006. So we're 9 years into it. Should it be a startup? Well, part of what they're doing, they're in a really aggressive market, and it might actually spin off into its own company at some point or whatever. So I would say there's an argument that for some portion, not 50% or 90%, but maybe 5 to 15% of the people, maybe on the top responsible people, or maybe 5% of all the people involved in AWS, because there's a lot of people wandering around hallways and pulling servers in and out and just doing routine maintenance stuff. That's a regular job. They don't have responsibility for development. They have responsibility for operations, and those are normal jobs, right? And then people above them have operational responsibility, and people above them have strategic and planning and spending responsibility. So you could argue that is more of a culture in which that makes sense. And as I say, there's not a negative thing to say about it. It's a business they built. They didn't destroy other businesses to do it. They built their own software. They spent billions of dollars. They have created, they were a big part of creating a huge competitive market in which they are fighting just as hard as everyone else is for a piece of it. They dominate parts of it, but they can't be a bully. So I look at that and go, okay, well, there you go. Like, that all makes sense, right? I look at the other parts of businesses they're in, and I say, there's no reason, the aggressiveness by which they enter a market has nothing to do with how hard they're working people or how they come up with ideas. They say, the part of the article that I think isn't disputed is that Amazon is a very, it's a contentious, a company in which ideas contend in like an incredibly, I don't say vicious isn't right. The article might be more on the vicious side, but ideas are fought out among people and people at lower levels. And this is the holacracy idea, which they don't do there, but it's that idea is that a lower level person can come up with an idea or challenge something and really be heard. That's supposedly what happens there. And there were examples in the article, I think, in which that was cited. The way it wastes time is that when problems have been solved and you have people at lower levels or newer people who don't know it, you waste time explaining them and going through them and solving them over and over and over again when it should be settled. But sometimes one of those ideas turns out to be, huge difference. I don't think you have to have a vicious company culture. And when you read some of the stories, you say this is vicious. People are unhappy with it. People cry at their desks. Some people say, I've never seen anyone cry at my desk. That's fine. You didn't see it, but someone else is citing examples of what they saw routinely in their division, which you may never have even walked into those offices or building. Do you have to be vicious to have these ideas? I would say no, because there are plenty of companies in which the culture sounds well run and calm and reasonable, and they're also coming up with innovative, amazing ideas for both selling products, creating products, manufacturing, selling stuff, or creating services. So let's take Apple. People work crazy hours at Apple still, but a lot of people work normal hours.
I'm glad, because Apple's such the obvious parallel example where that's a company where the culture has been legendarily cutthroat and hardworking and to a degree vicious, like you say.
It's been taught, but I think that I want to say I know a lot of people, past and present at Apple. I mean, I know a lot of people joined recently, in fact, and I don't hear these kinds of stories privately from anybody. Like the stories you hear were about Steve Jobs being a big dick, basically. He was but not to everybody, not all the time. I've heard wonderful stories about what he's done for people too, and some of those came out in the more recent biography about him that was done with the family's cooperation. He couldn't have been the person that he gets caricatured. He certainly had those traits, and those traits were often dominant. And he's really aggressive. But the culture he spread, from everything I can tell, is not as cutthroat and nasty internally. People work hard and they contend over ideas, but I think it's more, I think people work to fulfill what they think is the best thing they should do, as opposed to fighting with other people to, like an arena of lions and centurions fighting or something. And I don't think I'm being naive, because I've known enough people over decades who've worked at Apple, and people who left years ago, and they tell stories about what it was like. And some of them were closer to the top, and some of them were, more like just, programmers, people on the line who were doing stuff they were supposed to do in teams. And the management there is not in any means perfect. It's not like some kind of paradise, but I don't feel like I've heard almost any story as horrible as the ones that were in that article, and then some other stuff I've heard routinely that's less horrible, but just about the driven pace and the lack of sort of a positive response. What was the other thing I wanted to unpack? Yeah, the Silicon Valley response. I mean, the thing is, not all companies are run like Amazon, but they're defending its culture as if it's an avatar of it, because it's so big, not necessarily so good. Like any company starting today, you really would not want a margin as bad as Amazon is settling for. And ultimately, their margins will increase if Amazon Web Services and some other higher margin lines of business, continue to grow. But Facebook, I can't remember what its margins are. They're nuts. It's like all the new businesses that Mark Andreessen and so forth are involved with. Software is eating the world. Those are all super high margin businesses in which you can leverage relatively small numbers of people to make a big service, and then you build and scale and hire more. But you have this outsized return. So it's funny that they're all leapt to defend Amazon. And it's also, these are all high level guys. So like, I never saw any of that. It's like, yeah, because no one's going to talk to you like that. No one's going to behave like that in a meeting. No one's going to come up to you and say, do you know this terrible thing that happened to me in a meeting? No one's going to say that to you. And then Jeff Bezos putting out the memo, it's not the Amazon I recognize. I believe that. If anything like this is happening to you, email me. Who's going to do that? Who is going to do that inside the company? Honestly.
So to put a pin in this, because I do want to get to our third topic.
Absolutely.
It does. The article did ring true to you, though, at least in the sense that it described traits that even 20 years ago when you left, you started to see the seeds of, and was one of the main reasons why you left.
Precisely. But although I would say at that time, I wouldn't have expected. I was disappointed in myself and how what was going on there and what I saw in my future. But I would also say I don't think what I saw 20 years ago was much different than you'd find in most startups. And it was certainly like, the stories were, Jeff never yelled at me when I screwed up. He would give me an incredibly good explanation of what went wrong and what I should do, and I learned a lot from it. He was really nurturing, like direct boss when that came up. I got off one phone call with him after I'd done something. I'd supplied data to some group that I didn't realize that we worked with, and I didn't realize the implication of it because they used that against us in a business dealing, and I had no idea. It was foolish of me. I realized later exactly what happened, but I was being lied to by this other company, and I was being too naive. And he called me up probably from the air because he was flying. He was probably on an expensive, airphone call in 1997, and he explained to me exactly what had happened was wrong and what I shouldn't do in the future. And I was like, oh, I totally understand. I get off the phone. I'm like, oh my God, I think I was just reamed out, and I feel good about it. Like, wow, that's amazing. What an amazing boss. So that's, what I think the problem is, I think his approach to things is a brilliant guy. And I think his approach to things, as it percolated down, there were some really nasty people when I worked there, and I would never want to work with them again. I don't ever want to see some of them again because I think they were slightly inhuman in the way they acted. And, some of that's that engineer culture, and some of it's the people who don't have empathy, do well in business thing. And I know they hired, after I left, I kept hearing stories within a few years of all these MBA types who really had no interest or understanding of the business, and they wasted a lot of money, and Amazon had to shut down a lot of stuff would happen in those years and kind of go back to its core. So the thing I would say about the article that is clearly, I would say, unfair in a certain way. Like, I don't think it's inaccurate, but I do think there was a lot more. There's a lot more positive and a lot more calm that goes on there, and I don't think the article was able to carve out and say, this only represents part of the company. And, the fact, like, the warehouse is a huge number of Amazon's employees, and that's its whole other thing. And that's how expose is written about it. And, there's a lot of people at Amazon who do just work a normal week, and they don't work this kind of thing. I think the stories are so extreme, and, in many cases, in some cases, confirmed by the company, or the one person, there's that great story, one person tells a story about how she hit a glass ceiling, and Amazon contacts her boss, who's no longer at Amazon, and says, yeah, that's what happened. And I'm like, oh my God, okay, that's what he said. And he's agreeing. He's not at the company anymore, but he actually went, or she went on the record to say that. But I think there is some percentage of the company that is just tootling along and doing its job and isn't experiencing any of this. I think this happens at higher levels in the company, in which people are contending for leadership positions and ideas, and it just sounds to me more intense and nasty, and more work than it needs to be to get the same results. I want to quote something in German to you, though.
Okay.
Because the thing that came down to me at the end is like, what is Amazon doing? They're selling stuff. They're not curing cancer. And there's a story by Heinrich Böll called "Es wird etwas geschehen," which means something must happen. It's just very funny. It's a really funny story I read in a German class years ago. Mm-hmm. And I always remember it. And there's this thing with this guy who's pretty lackadaisical. It's like, I needed to get a job. So I took this bus to this interview thing, and I realized they were watching us through one-way mirrors. And I did this whole, I did the whole shtick to make myself look excited, and was all like, what's your biggest problem? I work myself to death. And, he did the whole thing, right? And this is very modern for being written decades ago. And the boss goes running through the factory, and he says, he's like, runs around and says this phrase, "Es wird etwas geschehen," and people say, "Es muss etwas geschehen." Something must or something will happen, and people say, "Something must happen," and it's like this watchword, and they run around, and finally someone fractionally pauses in replying to him, and the boss drops dead. And it's this hilarious story, and I'm sure it's been translated. Something must happen. But the end of the story is the guy says, what did we make? We made soap. It doesn't mention the whole story, why they're so excited and running around and it's like, oh yeah, by the way, we were a soap factory. That's what this is all about, soap. And I feel like the Amazon story, it's like, oh my God, these people's lives being ruined and working so hard and breaking their health and being miserable and having practically or legitimately post-traumatic stress disorder, they're just shipping stuff, for crying out loud. All right, I've had my say about that part.
Well, no, I appreciate it. But at the risk of doing a hard right turn here,
absolutely.
The third thing that and you know what, I'm gonna wind you up and let you go again, because I don't actually have a specific question here. This is more you helping me analyze things to help me do better research and things like that. But as I said to you, as I've been exploring how newspapers, how magazines, how all sorts of publishers dealt with the arrival of the web and evolved to meet its challenges and whatnot. Almost everyone I've spoken to has been from the top, from the executive suite side of the story. And so I wanted to see if you could help me get a sense of what it was like to be a freelance writer, a journalist, whatever, over the last 20 years as the web has revolutionized publishing and it has gone electronic. I believe you've been a working journalist or writer for about 20 years, about that exact period of time?
Yeah, I think I left Amazon in, I'd say 8. Oh, that's a good question. I've been writing since 94 and being paid for it, like in print, since then. And I had kind of my full-time web development job. Then I was at Amazon. And so since May of 97, I've supported myself as a freelancer, with some amount of that time being, a good hunk of it being writing, and then now a lot of it being writing.
And we should say that you've worked for exclusively electronic side of it. You've worked for what people call the legacy dead tree side of it. So you worked for magazines and you've worked for websites and continue to do so both. So, okay, let me just reframe the question as I gave it to you.
I've written for HyperCard stacks. For
right. So let me reframe the question that I gave to you before we started recording, and then we'll let this take us wherever it goes. So what I want to try to understand is, and I might be wrong about this, but I get the sense that especially when blogging came around, that with the Gawker model of getting young kids, paying them $30,000 a year, and 30 posts a day or whatever, and obviously some people, good friends of mine, have taken that track and have ridden it to greater success, greater financial success, all sorts of things. I want to know, is the sense that being a writer in the digital realm was always valued less, always paid less than legacy? And my theories would be that maybe at the beginning, because let's say you're working at Pathfinder, so you're in the Time Warner empire, but you're an experimental part of the empire. So they're not valuing it like they would value you writing for a cover story for Time magazine. And then did that just continue? Was it a continual thing down the years that the digital side of the work has always been less valued? I don't know if I'm right. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but go.
This is a fantastic question, because I think the issue, so I'll even go back further. So all of my friends and colleagues and things I've read about the early 1970s, about like what freelance writers were paid. So staff writers, like newspapers were unionized almost entirely. Magazines, I don't know if they were unionized, but people were paid awfully well. Freelancers got what I think is the equivalent of $5 a word today for major magazines. You could sell, I was just reading a book about New Yorker cartoonists, some of whom, been doing cartoons for 50 or 60 years. And in the old days, in the like 40s to 60s, I think, they would just walk down the street, and each day of the week was a different day to meet with editors, or there were some days you met with a bunch of them. You showed them all the stuff you'd sketched up, and they bought some, and sometimes they wrote the caption for them. And it was a glorious time, and people would get something like, what was the equivalent of like $1,000 for one cartoon in those days, because there was so much ad money and so much subscription money. And even in the 70s, it was still a massive market, and people were reading like crazy and buying, and there was money. And so in relative terms, it was really easy to, I want to say easy, to make a living relative to the amount of work you had to do. And so you could put in a lot more work, and you'd have people who were freelancers writing in magazines and traveling and putting months into something and then getting these huge fees, and it all sort of working out economically. And so somewhere between the 70s and 90s, that equation changed, and freelancers became devalued, because by the time I started writing for print for the New York Times, which had a digital section, but it was essentially for print. The length was for print, the style was for print, and it also ran online for what was called the circuit section in, that was 1998, I think. And they're paying 50 cents a word, which today is probably the equivalent of, if I do the math, it's probably about 25 or 30 cents a word today. And that's terrible. And that was for print. And staffers at the time were probably getting the equivalent of 3 or 4 times that in salary for the same sort of output. I mean, it depends by reporter how much they did and what was expected and whether they were doing investigative stuff. But there was a big gap between being on staff and being a freelancer. And I think they had set a lower rate some years before, and then inflation just was pretended not to exist. So I know they pay more now, but I haven't written for them for a decade. Partly some of my editors left and shifted around. Partly I was like, I can't work for this little for what they expect. And what I think there was, the thing that happened is that though in the digital division, digital only publications, to be sure, or like Pathfinder, as you mentioned, the early Time Warner project, those hired young people typically. So you'd have maybe still young people or older people in management positions getting paid, salaries like everyone gets paid in management. But the people involved in producing stuff were undervalued and were paid, coming out of college or in their 20s, and were paid crummy media wages. And a lot of media wages were really terrible. The whole newspaper thing was, in the old days, like meaning 20 years ago, is you would get paid like $18,000 a year if you were lucky, working in Podunk, Illinois, at a paper, and you'd be doing sports reporting and local reporting and all kinds of stuff, and you would work your way up. And eventually, if you're lucky, you get a job at a bigger daily in a metropolitan area where you want to be and start making, 40, 50, 60. Then up in the New York Times, I want to say, was paying as much as $90,000 a year to reporters. And I'm not sure that's
the old
correct.
model was really sort of the oldest school apprenticeship style. Yeah.
And you got paid really awful as a starting reporter in a small market, but you could make a good wage. And because they were unionized jobs in most cases, by the time you would reach, you could be in the field for 5 years and be making a good wage. In 10 years, you could have, something that was the equivalent of a protected job for life that paid a good wage. You had to work hard because reporting has always been hard, and it always involved, not a startup job, but it's still whatever. So I think that on the digital side, I think the work was valued less, and partly because there was often no model behind it. There was either no extra money coming in or very little, as with the New York Times, it had very little online advertising. So in the late 90s, and I think that got perpetuated forward. So even as business models advanced, the wages paid did not. And so, there's times like I've said openly, like from 98 to 2005, I don't know, I filed 100 stories for the New York Times, and I subsidized that with other work. I was doing conference planning, I was doing programming, I was writing for some publications that paid more per hour, let's say, even if the word rate didn't match up. I was writing for doing digital stuff where the actual resulting time, the hourly rate was very good. And I liked writing for the New York Times. I liked being able to do the stuff they let me do. So I worked for a bad wage until such a point where I'm like, I've done enough. This is enough. It's getting too hard to pitch and get people to respond. And, they're not talking about raising wages, so I'm out. And then at that point is when I started writing for The Economist, which paid a lot better. And I've continued to do so to the present day.
Is it also maybe part and parcel with, everyone complains that all news, all information has sort of been commoditized by the web. Is that a part of it as well? Driving down or keeping the pay that digital writing can generate?
Well, I think I want to say that the supply of writers got much bigger when so traditional publications often kept their standards very high for online writing. And for instance, like The Economist, they wound up developing dozens of blogs. And I wrote for one of them called Babbage. I wrote more or less 2 columns a week for 4 years. And every one of those was, as they say in Britain, subbed by a sub-editor, edited them before they went up. And sometimes we had to go back and forth. We'd edit it like, hammer and tongs, like it was going in print. Other times I'd write something, be a few minor changes, they'd be happy with it, and would go up, depending on the topic. And some of them were reported, some were sort of essays. And so some publications, and that's why The Economist now has many fewer blogs, they decided to focus more effort into less online that was more refined. And it's a sensible thing based on traffic and where people are going and where their efforts are. So that makes sense. But a lot of publications kept that attitude, but because they didn't have a budget associated with it, they would pay a lot less. So I'm not sure they valued the content less. But then I think the thing that really happened is that when you had publications that were digital native, and started up and had, and this is really, let's say up to 2001. So I should point out, so in 2001, I was getting like $2.50 a word for writing for Business 2.0. Which was awesome, and I'd love to see that again someday. And that's because Business 2.0, Industry Standard, and Fortune, other publications were running as much as they could because they had so much ad revenue coming in from all of the companies that had gotten IPO money and investment before it collapsed. There's a second class. Did I talk about this last time? The second class mailing privileges thing.
No, but I do want to interject when I go when I go to the library and get out the old issues of Industry Standard. By 1999, they're 500 pages.
Yeah, and were they bi-weekly at that point, or fortnightly rather, or they?
No, I think it was bi-weekly.
Still monthly.
It was bi-weekly. They might have gone to weekly by the tail end of 99, but I'm telling you, these are 500-600 page magazines.
Yeah, Business 2.0 went to fortnightly by 2000, 2001, because so the rule is, now it's called, I forget, it's not second class mailing, it's called like periodical mail or something. And the rule is there's a percentage, and I forget if it's 75% or 66%. I think it's 75% is the limit of advertising to editorial content, and the post office defines what they mean by editorial content. So if you want to get cheap mailing prices that's affordable below first class, you have to meet this rule. So they were getting so much advertising, had such a huge shortage of writing, the rates went up and up and up and up. And so I got put in a contract where even if they couldn't run me, they were paying me. They put me on retainer, and I would just write like crazy, and they would, and I got like $2.50 a word, and subtracted from the retainer, and they'd pay me more if I exceeded that. And then the bottom fell out, and all these magazines went out of business, or became really thin, or transformed into something slightly different. And that was the last time that good rates were available. And I think what happened from that point forward is when that collapse occurred, it was still a print thing. Like I was getting $2.50 a word for print. None of this was online. If I did something that was online only, it was still being paid, really badly. It might have been 16 cents a word, or 30 or 50. And I would do some of that, especially if it was stuff I liked and I could turn it around fast. And I've always looked at the, hourly wage as opposed to the per word wage. to make it work. But what I think after that is, as things went to born digital, those were all started on shoestrings, and a lot of them were really tiny. People weren't, founding the Huffington Post until later. They were starting up things like Gizmodo, which was, Pete Rojas just working all the time, just writing 100 hours a day. And then everyone they brought on was writing crazy amounts. They were getting paid crap, and they got bonuses based on page views and things like that. And I think that just became a model where it was like, yeah, we're going to pay you terribly, and you're going to write a lot, and you're going to learn, and then maybe, at some point we'll figure out how to pay you more. And these are for staff jobs, and the freelance money was typically awful. And I think in that period of time, the middle 2000s, I was writing for the Seattle Times, which paid, again, the hourly was good. The word rate was terrible. The hourly was good. I was doing conferences. I was doing, a bunch of different stuff to make a living, programming, and try to write for business publications, things like InfoWorld, which was still in print and paid very well because they were in print. And then it went, then it essentially went online only and sort of disappeared at some point too. And so I think digital writing was valued digital only. Sort of born digital publications were tiny and cheap and did not have a lot of money coming in, and they worked their staffers to death, and they paid freelancers badly. And then I think that set the pattern even when new publications started up that came from a print background, or they were print publications that started to do a lot more online. And developed an online schedule or amount of content that didn't match. They're like, well, we really can't afford. We don't have the revenue. We don't have, so we're going to pay really badly. And so that was tough. The interesting thing for me, though, is starting in 2008, when the worldwide economy went bad, my personal experience was everything got better. I don't know why. I had the suspicion that publications had to lay off so many people. They had so much smaller staffs, they had to actually offer more because they just didn't have the people to do what they needed to do to pay the bill or to get the revenue. And so rates started to get better. And then in about 2013, I feel like there was another big uptick. Again, I don't know why, because a lot of the publications I wrote for in 2013 and into 2014 raised the rates dramatically. In some cases, 3 to 5 times the rate for online writing, because I think something ticked over. I think they started to have better online models and thus bigger budgets. And I think they also had trouble attracting the kind of writers they needed because people just went and did other stuff. They went into PR. They were running their own sites. They were doing, other projects that paid well. They're doing, professional writing as opposed to necessarily reporting, white papers and things like that. And I know a lot of people who do a lot of writing that, they're journalists. They do a lot of writing that is not for, journalistic publications. And it's not a conflict of interest, or they're careful about who they write for, or they're writing for, academic groups or nonprofits, things like that. And I think that has helped drive the wage up finally. I was just, before we were recording, I was mentioning The Economist just came out. Excuse me, this is, should I say the date? I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. All right, it's August 28th. So in the August 27th issue, I don't know if we have an artificial date this is recorded on. In the August 27th issue, they have a piece called A Brand New Game, and it's really nice because it collects the latest figures for ad sales and projections out to 2017. And this matches what I've seen before, is that newspaper advertising in newspapers and magazines, actually I should say the magazine part of it is shrinking, but not as much as the newspaper part did. And it's projected to shrink further, but that's advertising in print newspapers. It's not online advertising for newspapers that also have a print edition. So globally, since 2009, there's been an increase of like every year. It's like 20 or 30 billion dollars more globally, not adjusted for inflation, but that, inflation's been very low during this period of time. So it's a real increase. And so, this year, it's about 500 something billion dollars worldwide for television, newspaper, magazine, radio, outdoor, like billboard, cinema, which is a measurable slice apparently, and internet. And internet is, of course, the only part that's really growing at any real pace. TV is growing a bit, but probably not much more than inflation. Internet is growing by leaps and bounds. It'll be it's like $150 billion today, and it's going to be like $180 billion in 2 years. So that's where the money's going, and a lot of it's going to paid search, and not so much of it's going elsewhere. So the money is still out there, and it's growing, but it's not getting filtered into necessarily publications that then in turn pay freelancers or staffers.
Well, okay, this will lead into a different question. I actually have said this in a previous episode when I spoke with Steve Yelvington, who is a pioneer of newspapers going on the web, and I had said that I think I quoted that it was Ezra Klein that said that this is the best time in history to be a writer because there's now this explosion of outlets. Now, subsequently, I've not been able to find, so it might not have been Ezra Klein, but I feel like it was one of this new generation of bloggers that turned into media personalities that have, created now their own publications and things like that. So, like you said over email, this question, like, is journalism as a profession better off or worse off than 20 years ago, 10 years ago? Is it a thing where there's been 1,000 flowers that have bloomed and you can get everywhere on the spectrum from long reads and the All to BuzzFeed and what have you, so that if you're a young kid coming out of journalism school today, would you be optimistic for that kid or pessimistic?
Well, that's also a very, very thoughtful question, because I want to say it really varies by country, and I don't know enough to comment in depth about anything but the U.S. But there are other countries in which, even with some economic dips, they never saw, like, newspapers are still very popular in, was it Denmark, I think, has a huge newspaper circulation. In countries in which which literacy rates are lower, there's actually more newspapers read. And places where people have less online access or it's expensive and through a cell phone, there's newspapers being read. Newspapers are super cheap, and they also push an enormous amount of advertising because they reach huge audiences. So the U.S. is not unique in the media landscape that's changed, but it is not what's happened here is not what's happened elsewhere uniformly. So that's one reason why I think when you look at these global numbers for advertising, they mask a little bit of some of the effects happening in America. So I would say in America specifically, I would argue that journalism is probably at a better place now than it has been for 20 or 30 years. But it's not about money is the problem. Like, if you want to look about, like, are more people employed at livable or good wages? Livable is a tricky measure, but, like, it's a hard. So here's a statistic. I looked this up before we talked, which was in 2001, the American Society of Newspaper Editors said that newsroom employment was, this is the peak, I think, in history, was 56,393. And so that's all newsroom employees, not the business side, other folks in newspapers in America. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't include magazines, which is always a smaller number, and doesn't include TV and whatever. 2015, so that's 56,000 people roughly. 2015, they found 33,000 people, right? So that's a drop of 13 or 23,000 jobs. That's a huge drop. But the question is, and these are full-time jobs. The question is, and a population over, 15 years, population has grown by tens of billions. So conceivably, as a percentage of overall employment, that's even a worse drop. Maybe it's a 50% drop, right, or more. But the thing I wonder is, I have this theory that that all of the things being equal, if newspapers hadn't had such a precipitous drop, like let's say they'd gotten a better grasp online and they were able to shift ad revenue better, and it wasn't this horrible thing, but it was more of a shift and it was flatter rather than whatever, I actually think newspapers would have in the process either shifted a lot of employees or cut them, because I think the internet makes news more efficient. And so dissemination is more efficient. So it's not talking about the pressmen or the presswomen and the distribution and circulation. Like, that's its own thing that would have changed. But I think reporting is easier now than it used to be, because you can communicate with people globally by voice and video. You have access to so much more now than 15 years ago that's been scanned. I do stories now where I can find almost every kind of primary document I need online. And occasionally I can't, but it's actually becoming rarer and rarer, and I don't have to pay for most of those too. And, so I can interview 20 people. I can record the calls. If I need to have them transcribed, I can send them to an online service that charges a really small fee per hour to turn them into a transcription. I mean, so all of these things that used to be huge overhead for reporters, I think is naturally maybe more people efficient. I can write bigger stories more rapidly and more accurately or more completely than I could have before, because I simply couldn't have afforded the time, and they couldn't have paid me to do it. So I had to have a smaller scope, or just, I don't know, wouldn't have had as complete a picture of things. So I don't know, are more people, is more money being paid to people engaged in journalism today than 15 years ago? I don't know that. I don't know. It probably is, and it probably is a lot more, but it involves so many more people. It's the long tail thing. So there are still people getting paid. I think it's much more unlikely you get paid zero to write something online now that's running in a publication with advertising. So a friend of mine wrote something for a major venture capital backed publication, and I want to name it because I don't know what the rates are publicly, and they offered her $200 to write something. She'd written some online for other publications for very little, that were startups and labors of love, and she got connected with somebody and pitched, and I was like, $200 is not bad. Like, it's not good, but she's practically a first-time writer. She's got a voice. I think she wrote something really good for them that fit the bill, and they gave her editorial support and helped her and edited it and worked with her. And I was like, that's not terrible. If that's what people are paying today, if it's between $50 to $200 to write something like that for a new writer to get new voices in, and then they pay more for people with experience, then that is not horrible. And you can't make a living off that, but it's also not an offensive wage relative to what's being offered. So, and I know, publications I write for, they used to pay, maybe it's like $150 or $200 for something, and I might do some of that for them sometimes if I had something I could write in a couple hours and I felt good about it. Some of them are now paying $500 to $700 for the same thing. I'm like, all right, well, that is becoming a livable wage. Like, I can write that and do a thorough job to my standards, to their standards, and then actually make a living if I do that full time.
All right, one more question. Do you think standards are rising? Like you just were speaking about that, getting away from the, everyone was down on HuffPo and BuzzFeed for these aggregators and all this stuff. Do you feel that online, the standards for digital writing are improving?
I think so. My feeling is that as publications pay more, they demand more. And I think they're paying more because they want better. And this is not to knock people who were getting paid less, because I was getting paid less myself. But I believe there are a finite number of people who can write to specification for publications. And it's not, 10 million. And it's not maybe 1 million. There's somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of range, that could write in a journalistic style and have the experience or can learn well enough to do it. And then there's a larger group that's in the millions that I think could write for a wider variety of publications, especially about things that are more opinion-based or, fashion. And not that you don't have to be knowledgeable about fashion, but without reporting. You could have an incredible internal catalog of like the last 50 years of fashion in America without ever having done any reporting. And you could write something about a new fall line from some organization or from, house. And that's not necessarily reporting. And it's not to knock that kind of writing, but that a larger group of people who are very knowledgeable can write. So here's a great example. This guy, Dr. Drang, I don't know his real name. He's a consulting engineer. He has a very popular blog that a lot of Mac people consult, even though it's rarely about Mac stuff in specific. And he writes incredibly cogently, superb style about often some fairly, not arcane, it's stuff in his field, but things about force and motion and measure and stress and materials. And it's really interesting. And it's on his blog. Now, is that guy a journalist? No, he's not a journalist. Is he writing in a style that the Economist would publish? No, it's too technical. But the quality of what he's writing is very good. And I would say there's a lot of people like that who have learned through internal editing or working with other people to write, or just have a natural knack to write in an expressive and clear way that reaches an audience correctly, whether it's thousands or millions. And they really don't do any reporting. But what they're writing is better and better, and people find them because the writing is good. I think on the reporting side, I think people writing more classical journalism, maybe that hundreds of thousands of people in America doing something like that. And maybe it's larger. I want to say at least hundreds of thousands, but some people fit in that category. Some people are writing one thing a month or a year, and other people are writing, 5 articles a day. I think that's gotten better because the supply must be constrained, because you don't pay more if you have a ready supply. So I've assumed that I am more in demand as an experienced writer, but also my friend who is a first-time writer being offered $200. And I've heard other similar stories of things like $125 or $75 for a blog post that's, a few hundred words. That's a very high return if you're good at pushing stuff out efficiently. That to me says there's a constrained supply of writers who meet the bill for publications who are demanding more.
Sounds cautiously optimistic,
Well,
but
is
certainly
very cautiously
optimistic.
Well, and I'll tell you this one thing, which is that I feel like I'm being compensated better now than I have been in years, but I also feel like I'm undercompensated by nearly everybody I write for. And I don't mean like they're trying to steal from me, but more like just figuring in inflation, my costs, healthcare, because I'm freelance, I have a family I'm supporting, all those things. Like I really should be being paid somewhere between 25% and 100% more by almost everybody I write for. And it's not like I can't make a living. It's more like I know I'm being underpaid relative to people with similar staff jobs and relative to what I was paid post economic collapse, even, or even pre run up in the 90s and post collapse when things sort of settled back to normal. It hasn't kept pace with inflation and other costs, and so it's a very hard thing to get up in the morning and write for less. So the rates going up was good. Some of the rates that went up are like, I'm like, that's great. I don't need to get paid more than that. Like, it'd be great if I was, but when you're paying, publication X, that's totally reasonable. That meets my bar. But a lot of them are still, even with increases, are lagging. And what I'm hoping is I'm going to start, quite honestly, using some leverage because I have things I can turn down now and maybe not write for some publications or not write certain kinds of pieces because they can't meet my rate. And I think that'll be an interesting thing to try.
Well, let me end with an aside to you and to the audience, because I've actually kind of accidentally discovered that when I recommend books, especially tangentially related history books, the audience tends to really, really love that. So it's funny. I've been thinking about this media thing recently because have you ever read the book by David Halberstam called The Powers That Be?
Oh, no, I've heard of that book like my whole life, I think.
Well, so this is my recommendation. If you want to get a really good overview of how the 20th century big media infrastructure was built, and he covers how the newspaper dynasties, he covers, like Henry Luce and Time getting started. He covers CBS, so radio and television getting started, and it's only up through about the mid 70s, so it doesn't quite take it to the modern era. But I highly recommend, if anybody's curious about the history of media in the 20th century, the good old days that Glenn and I were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, when your expense accounts were basically bottomless. I recommend The Powers That Be by David Halberstam. I'll put that in the show notes also.
I'd also recommend, it's a book, it's not a recent book, but it's I'm trying to remember when it came out now. I'm trying to look this up as we're talking, but it's by Ken Doctor, who I think I spoke about last time. Maybe it's called Newsonomics. And the book came out in 2010, I think. That's what I'm seeing here. Yeah, it came out in 2010. 12 new trends that will shape the future of news or the news business. And he was at, I think I did tell this story that he ran a small weekly paper in Eugene, Oregon, where I grew up, and my dad worked for him in the 80s. And then the paper went under during an economic time of trouble. He did not want to be, he did not want to have, didn't want to make it free ad supported. He wanted to charge for it, and that was his. And it had ads, but he also wanted to have a subscription fee. He thought that was worthwhile. And they did great journalism. A lot of interesting people came out of it. But then he surfaces again at Knight Ridder, and he works there for quite a while. And he was influential in some of the directions they took in digital news. And then he after he left Knight Ridder, he just writes really smart things. He's a consultant in the industry. He really gets it. He's gotten it since '95, like when stuff started to happen. That he was on top of it. So the book is good. And Neiman Journalism Lab, he writes there regularly about newsonomics. And because he was inside the industry, he kind of knows how everything worked. And he's been pretty accurate about his predictions about the directions. I mean, not specifics, but like how things are shifting. So another good book and person to follow. Ken Doctor.
While we're on the subject of recommending books, why don't you tell us about the magazine book that I believe just was successfully published, or the fundraising was just finished, right?
Well, you're very kind. Yeah, I did the fundraising. So the magazine existed from October 2012 to December 2014. It was 58 issues, almost 300 articles, all that were commissioned for it. I was the editor and then bought it from the founder a few months into it. And so there's almost 300 nonfiction, like narrative nonfiction stories and some essays in there. And I did the Kickstarter earlier this year to raise the money to have both like a combination of time and production cost to turn it into a giant ebook, and it's done. So if you go to the-magazine.com, there's a link to buy the darn thing. It's 1,800 pages in PDF form. It's about almost 500,000 words. It'll keep you busy for a while, and it's just this. We did this huge array of stuff. The idea was things that would be interesting to people who had a technical bent, like how they looked at the world, but that weren't necessarily about technology at all. And so we started out more tech focused, and then broadened into things like writing about goats that produce spider silk in their stomachs, and airport museums, and solar power in eastern Washington, and just lots of things that we try to delve into it and find people's stories, but they were sort of about things that were sort of appealing and quirky, or the giant lava lamp that was never built.
I would hazard to say that kind of describes the audience that's listening to this podcast.
Excellent. Well, you will all love this book.
Yes, I think so. Also, I think you're back to podcasting regularly since the last time we talked. What podcast can we hear you on?
Oh yeah, I'm the host of the Macworld podcast, which is about to hit its 500th episode next year. I think we will. It turned out I was the first guest when an intern who is now an Ars Technica writer, Surus Farivar, wanted to try out this podcasting thing. So I'm on episode number 1 over 10 years ago of the podcast, and I'd been on it at various times in its history. And then I've been the host since March, and I talk typically with Macworld's executive editor, Susie Oakes, and we talk about Apple stuff that happened in the week and related things, and bring on guests, and it's a good time. So Macworld.com, and the podcast is linked there.
Excellent. Glenn Fleishman, thank you for being so generous and coming back on the show. And as with the first episode that you did, this was just fantastic stuff, and I can't thank you enough.
Oh, well, thank you. I love having an outlet to talk about these things that make me crazy or interested, so I appreciate it.
If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. There's plenty more great internet history where that came from. And if you're a longtime listener, then you know what to do to help us out. Rate and review us on iTunes. Because iTunes gives credit to reviews and ratings, and the more great reviews we get, the more people will discover us. As always, there's more info on our website, www.internethistorypodcast.com. The show's Twitter handle is @NetHistoryPod, and my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.